Good. The lights are bright. All right. Good evening, everyone. If we could ask you to take your seats, please. All right. Thank you. I'd like to welcome you to this evening's lecture, which is sponsored by the Leslie and Irene Dubé Chair for Catholic Studies. My name is Sarah Powery, and I teach Catholic Studies at the college. Let's begin by grounding ourselves and becoming aware of this place where we are gathered. We find ourselves here on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We reflect and remember the First Nations and Métis ancestors of these lands, the original caretakers of the land for countless centuries, and we reaffirm our relationship with one another. Established in 2012, the Leslie and Irene Dubé Chair was founded to support scholarship in Catholic studies, broadly defined to include the history of Catholic thought, as well as contemporary expressions of Catholic experience. The purpose of the Dubé Chair is to encourage the advancement of Catholic education and to be a source of intellectual leadership for the broader Catholic community. Over the last number of years, this work has taken the form of conferences and public lectures, which have created opportunities for reflection and dialogue. As our forms of media and communication grow increasingly crowded, noisy, and polarizing, the conversations facilitated by the Dubé Chair seem all the more vital. They invite us to reflect on the private life of faith, the ethical questions of the public sphere, and to discern carefully how each of these realities should inform one another. We wish to offer thanks to Leslie and Irene Dubé for their philanthropic leadership, which continues to enrich STM and the wider Saskatoon community. Their good stewardship has yielded an abundance, and we are the beneficiaries of their generosity. It is my great pleasure tonight to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Sami Helewa, a Jesuit priest and previous president of Campion College in Regina. He comes to us today from Ottawa, where he is undertaking a sabbatical project, the focus of which forms the theme of tonight's lecture. Dr. Helewa began his early career in business and journalism, but at a certain point felt called to the study of scripture and to a priestly vocation. He completed a licentiate in sacred theology and a master's in theology from the Weston Jesuit School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. After studying Catholic theology, he then turned his attention to the Islamic tradition. He completed a master's in religious studies at the University of Toronto, focusing on the representation of Mary, Mother of Christ, in medieval Islamic texts. He then pursued a PhD in religious studies at the University of Edinburgh, in which he studied the medieval Islamic response to the Hebrew prophets Joseph, David, and Solomon. This thesis formed the basis of a scholarly book published in 2017. At Campion College in Regina, Dr. Helewa taught courses on Christianity and Islam, on Christ, and on the Prophet Muhammad. During his time in Regina, Dr. Helewa held significant leadership roles. He was Jesuit superior from 2014 to 18, and he served as the president of Campion College for 7 years from 2018 to 25. After a lifetime of studying these sibling spiritual traditions, Islam and Christianity, and after more than a decade of leadership, it seems appropriate that Dr. Helewa would turn his attention to the patriarch Abraham, the father figure for these faith traditions, and to consider his life narrative as a model of leadership in challenging and uncertain circumstances. The title of Dr. Helewa's talk is Abraham the Migrant, Search for Belonging. Please join me in offering a warm welcome to our speaker this evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to come back after I left the prairies about 6 weeks ago. It sounds like I couldn't be away. Last July, I had the privilege to be in Budapest, in Hungary. And there I was inside a musical hall where the famous pianist Franz Liszt used to play his recitation and also teach other students, privileged students. And inside the music hall, I noticed in one of the balconies there was an image of a swan. And that swan image is a message to the performers, meaning the swan song, which means you have no second chance. Do the best you can. And that's what I feel now. As I was finishing the work as president of Campion College, which is a sister college to St. Thomas More, the ideas of migration and belonging, both of them, have been perking in my thoughts for a long time, both as ideas, as the news coverage that we are hearing daily, as the environmental deterioration was happening, and also I started to feel for these migrants more than just think about them. I'm not off the mark to say that in many ways we're all affected by migration, whether in our past of family stories, people among our ancestors who have migrated before, or our own sense and experience of migration. Migration is a human phenomenon, for sure, and has thrown many of us into what we claim about ourselves today. We do come from other places. Whatever we claim about ourselves these days, we inadvertently reveal something about where we belong or not belong. Therefore, for me, migration and belonging are so interlinked, human development at both personal and communal levels. The question is, where do we belong? Where do I belong? Where do you belong? It is embedded in the narratives of many migrants. My paper today, or whatever I'm going to present to you, is a work in progress. In other words, I don't know everything. I really want to go back to the biblical figure of Abraham, but also the Quranic figure of Abraham. But I will focus more on the story of Genesis for a reason is in the book of Genesis we have a more long, well-treated story of Abraham. There are reasons why I chose Abraham and the theme of migration. Almost 2 years ago, I happened to be in a conference in the city of Chicago, and there I attended one of the lectures or talks or presentation on the status of refugees. And it came to my attention statistics that really troubled me. That once a refugee enters a refugee camp, it takes about 17 years to kick him out from the refugee camp. Some people have disputed the length of time, but on average, at least 10 years. As a Jesuit priest, and giving the ideal of the Jesuit thing about the magus, what more can we do? I started to think we ought to have a better world for refugees. I have also a personal reason, and that's where my story kicks in a bit. I was born stateless. I am of a Palestinian origin. I didn't have a country for 24 years of my life, the first 24 years. I never had a birth certificate, so I cannot prove to you that I was born. Belonging naturally became a persistent personal issue. Even when I became a citizen of this good country, Canada, one has to question where we belong. But first, I want to acknowledge a couple of things here about belonging. I do belong to a family. I do belong to a culture. I do belong to a circle of friends. I do belong to school institutions, especially those where I studied. But I never had citizenship for the first 24 years. And they were deforming years for me as a human being. So belonging to a nation was an urgency I could not afford to delay or neglect, as life events became too difficult for people without citizenships. So you may appreciate the fact that my interest in a biblical figure like Abraham, who was privileged with the promise of becoming father of nations, is very appealing to me, who was once a stateless person. The stateless years formed me and formed my faith in God and in God's kingdom, out of necessity, but also out of gratitude. My faith in God arose from a state of no state. I went through a civil war for 8 years, and in those years I started to question myself. I was 13 and I stayed in war till age 20, so basically all my teen years. I had to survive. So Abraham, for me, who entered into different cultures that differed from his Sumerian town Ur, where he was born and presumably where he had his initial stage of formation in his growing years. The question is, why Abraham? The answer is, why not Abraham? The Torah has long narratives of migrants, such as the story of the Moses in the book of Exodus. Moses has a particular and clear mission, which, as you know, was to deliver his people from a tyranny of the Pharaoh before the prolonged testing period in the desert and the formation of a new humanity in the desert. He had a project given to him by divine authority. Abraham, on the other hand, did not have a project. He had no particular mission project as such. His name, as we know, changed from Abram to Abraham as the relationship developed with this monotheistic God. He never gave any instructions, never wrote books. He wasn't a lawgiver as Moses was. He simply did what was asked of him. So by comparison, when we look at Moses and Abraham, Abraham was a community builder under very difficult circumstances. For Abraham, perhaps if we want to say about mission for him, it's really self-discovery. In terms of his story in the book of Genesis, which I presume you have an idea about, it's the main and earliest narrative source we have about Abraham. But the first 11 chapters of Genesis, because the story of Abraham starts with chapter 12 till 26, 27. So the first 11 chapters of Genesis, Abraham is not there. After the creation accounts, the stories of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and then of course we have the towering figure of Noah and his flood challenge, we meet God, who was already disappointed with humans and interfered in the most drastic manner, the flood orchestration. Just before we encounter Abraham's story, the flood serves both as a damage control against human disobedience to God and the first apocalyptic scale of environmental crisis we ever have recorded in the Torah. After most of the people were wiped away, we see a new beginning with the story of Abraham, or later Abraham. The late Dr. Edward Said of Columbia University, and his powerful thoughts, especially his early thoughts, he said something about that there was one origin of things followed by many new beginnings. In a way, that's exactly where the story of Abraham fits. It's a new beginning after the creation story. It's a story of a new human beginning in a relationship with a God who changed his approach in dealing with the human difficulties and the diversity of cultures that Abraham entered. To say that salvation entails migration and leads to belonging is perhaps a new outlook or approach in the drama of being human, to use the language of Balthazar's. Fundamentally, the question remains, where do I belong? Or where do we belong? And even a daring question, how our migration stories reflect our thirst, our quest for belonging. Can today's migration be divorced from the question of belonging, no matter how we look at it? So, what is migration? Migration is a movement of people or animals from one place to another. It's a part of nature. We see that among many living species. We know geese, for example, migrate at least twice in their lifetimes. They go across the globe flying as the seasons change. We know butterflies also migrate. And then we know also fish migrate, as just added examples. Therefore, humans are part of that human or natural phenomenon of mobility from one place to the other. Migration could be said as part of the seasons of nature. There are reasons for migrations, as you know, out of necessity and survival. Economic distress, life threats from political, environmental, and economic deteriorations are very common reasons for human migration. Our related human species, the non-existents now known as the Neanderthals, who were basically the cousin humans that we coexist for 100,000 years together, had several migrations across continent too. And we have evidence of their mobility and existence in recent years of excavations. In the more recent times, you look at the Arab Bedouins, they move frequently in search of water for their survival and for the survival of their animals. We see that in the narrative of prophets who migrated, often in distress with their communities of faith, to new territories, and sometimes as captives or prisoners of war. The prophet Jeremiah in Judaism is one example. The prophet Muhammad in Islam, when he left Mecca all the way to Medina, as prime reminder that holy people experience even the duress imposed on them and lead them to migration as part of their experiences of religious persecution. There's today's Middle East news and all the situation that has been happening there for the last 7 years forced my parents to migrate twice. The story of Abraham we hear, Abraham moved at least 14 times. Hence, Abraham for me could be a story of the collective narratives of our migrants today. We share something with him, albeit his context is very far from ours. What is belonging? The existentialist philosopher Gabriel Marcel spoke once of issues related to belonging. He said that human beings, in the face of modernity, need to participate. They need to have communal bonds. They need a life path that brings meaning to being human in particular contexts. History then speaking of themselves as self, as an object rather than a subject. Authentic relationships is at the core of his thoughts. We exist and grow in relationships, and presence, and creative fidelity. Philosophically, there's also Dr. James Greenaway, who talks about belonging in particular in terms of identity, in terms of self-understanding and connection to the material universe. Exclusion and alienation are for him meaningful experiences from which one can thirst for belonging and connection. Belonging, for Dr. Greenaway, is intimately personal. Kim Samuelson, who wrote a book on belonging, she did it from a sociological point of view. She wrote, belonging is a condition of a context where someone can grow as a person, where somebody could express freely his thoughts or her emotions, and to become a people thriving and even flourishing in that context. And therefore, belonging is a condition for Kim Samuel. Last June, I had the privilege to give a talk on hope in politics, and I did that at the Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg. And I took that topic from two angles, the angle of being a refugee and the angle of being a citizen. And I realized that refugees do hope in politics for some stability for their lives, whereas citizens hope from politics for thriving in their own countries. And therefore, between stability and thriving, there is the intertwined thread between them, and that is the sense of belonging. Therefore, I advocated back then for politics of belonging, which stands in contrast to the exclusion politics that we often experience in today's world. Therefore, I would like to ask you to consider reading the story of Abraham and Sarah in that context. What is the belonging thread that is in their narrative, especially after 11 chapters in the book of Genesis, and how God changed his approach from divine punishment to accompanying his people as migrants. It seems that salvation and migrancies are a strategic plan of God in the book of Genesis. If I have a methodology for the whole project, is the story in the book of Genesis, especially the story of Abraham, has a language of migrancy. And that migrancy is connected to belonging. And therefore, you can look at it in terms of the intervention, the revelation, migrancy, and belonging. And that's because we move sometimes by the power of the words that are uttered to us. And that's the case between God and Abraham. He made him move to many places. And that power of the words is basically the impetus, the beginning, the motivation, and they are the words that constitute eventually what I call promises. Who was Abraham? He was of a Chaldean origin from the ancient Sumerian city of Ur. Even Ur at his time was already an old town. We don't know much about his ancestors, but we know that chances are, given that it was in Mesopotamia, chances are Abraham might have belonged to a family of polytheists. In Mesopotamia, there were gods like Nana and others that people actually worshipped. And therefore, you can see that Abraham grew in a religious diversity. Ur was the capital of Lower Mesopotamia, and it was located about 225 kilometers from Babylon, another major stronghold. It's hard to tell where Abraham actually lived and when, but scholars say it could have been between 2017 to 1763 BCE. It's a range, it's a safe bet. Chances are he lived 170, 175 years during one of the episodes and the age in the Bronze Age, or the periods in the Bronze Age. We know nothing about his childhood, at least not from the book of Genesis, and even his youth in Genesis. We are introduced to him as an old fellow, already well in years. And this is the typical part of the Torah. It doesn't say too many things about childhoods. It rather compromises it into genealogies. He or she is son or daughter of whoever. So his father, his name was Terah. He has two brothers. Haran is his younger one, and Nahor was his eldest. And basically, Abraham, among the two brothers, was childless until much later in life. We don't know also how much Abraham understood his connection to Noah, the giant figure about the flood. We don't know if he understood and recalled in his mind intellectually or even emotionally if he knew exactly what happened during the flood. But it was a major event, at least in the life of God within the human relationships, and how eventually Abraham started to move into this relationship with one creator deity after many names like El Shaddai, Yahweh, the Lord, and so on. Nothing special about Abraham. He was a very ordinary person. We don't know about his talents, his personality. We don't know why was he even chosen to be considered for greatness. He was simply chosen. That's as far as biography could go. He was by nature a very mortal man, called and commissioned for extraordinary purpose. He had no children until later in life with a promise from God in one of the covenants. Abraham was nomadic. Even though he was born in a city, he learned to be nomadic. He had a lot of wealth in terms of cattle, and that means he had to move from one place to the other to make sure the cattle has enough to eat and drink. He became semi-nomadic at the end of his life, probably because of old age, or maybe things got better for him in the places that he went to. He never preferred to settle during his migration in any city contexts, except maybe in Haran with his father. He owned cattle, but he was not a caravan trader. He didn't carry goods from one place to the other like other people who were nomadic. We don't know why they moved to Haran with his father, but they stayed there for a bit. And after that, Terah, his father, died. And after he died, for some particular reason, Abraham took the center leadership of the family. Then God spoke to him. Listen to this language, please. Go forth from your native land, from your kin group, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. I don't know about you, but this is very powerful language of migration. He had a commission now to move, to be a source of blessings. This is a shift from God's divine punishment to the economy of blessings on the shoulder of Abraham in foreign territories. In many ways, it could be considered a project, but nothing is given for sure. He has to follow and to be shown where to go. And therefore, we see the language of migrancy appearing in Genesis chapter 12 at the very beginning of Abraham's story. Go forth from your kin group. Go forth from your father's house. Go to the land that I will show you. Compare this to the expulsion of Adam and Eve in the early chapters of the book of Genesis, their expulsion from the Garden of Bliss. And then the story of Cain after murdering his brother Abel, how he was cast away. These are not migration stories, these are expulsion. And Cain, we know, when he left, he started building a city. In the story of Abraham, we read no expulsions, but a command to go to new foreign regions in the process of becoming a universal leader and a source of blessings to others, with capacity for blessings as a lifelong experience for others. The text suggests that migration now is a means for rebuilding human integrity in the form of shared blessings. This is very important to keep in mind. Migration and shared blessings. The act of blessings, as the narrative suggests, could unite cultural diversity, if not unite nations itself. So Abraham's migration was fueled with a divine promise. And a promise is explicit hope. And his migration is a process of unfolding a promise that is hardly possible for an old man to start moving from one region to the other within the human context of his life and his wife's. At age 75, he started to migrate away from Haran. Abraham started to move. His nomadic life was in place. Chances are that he moved to Shechem, which went through one particular route is through Aleppo, across the river, then to Lebanon's hills, then he went to the oasis of Damascus, before he continued south through the skirts of Mount Hermon, then Jordan River, then Galilee and Samaria. Shechem was an important Canaanite center, religious but also political. And there, at his arrival, Abraham, there was a Canaanite temple of a different deity, where the Amorites themselves in the region had their worship to Baal, B-A-A-L. Many of these patriarchs who were nomadic often settled in places outside major cities. But in the case of Abraham, for some particular reason, he was attracted to places that have sanctuaries. And what makes a place a sanctuary are some conditions. God's appearance in that place, God's message is given. Perhaps there is a sacred tree or a fountain of water that is sacred too, or a burial place that is considered very important. We see that later when Joseph himself, before he died in Egypt, asked to be buried there. The first altar Abraham built was in Shechem. But nomadic life has its challenges. Water was becoming scarce. Environmental change was pushing him away, and he ended up in Egypt. He went with his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot. Now Lot was the son of Haran, the younger brother. And there Abraham started to play politics not in a good way. He hid his own relationship with Sarah, claiming that she is his half-sister only. But once Pharaoh knew the truth, he was expelled from Egypt. It's very interesting, Abraham, how lucky he was in the expulsion, because he got lots of provisions from the Pharaoh as a way for him to survive in the desert. Now they have a lot of wealth, maybe too big of wealth. He couldn't manage it by himself, so he has to divide it with his nephew Lot. And then they went separate ways around the town of Bethel. Now Lot got the eastern part of the land, and that entailed the city of Sodom, and Abraham stayed in Canaan. Between Bethel and Ai, another region, Abraham settled, stretched his tent, and was there. He built another sanctuary around Bethel. Context of war started to play its role too in the life of Abraham. The Babylonian and the Canaanite kings were at war to the point that the city of Sodom was destroyed almost. Lots of prisoners were taken, including Lot, his nephew. Abraham fought for Lot. He brought him back and released him from the prison and made deals even with the king of Sodom after that. Now, king of Sodom asked him to take all the provisions of the war to Abraham, but Abraham refused. He said, no, I give them back to you. I'll give you also back the people of the prisoners of wars that were taken from Sodom. But he gave also some of his provision to the people who helped him in fighting and bringing his nephew back, Lot. But also, we see there in the context of war a sign of peace. Do you remember what happened? He met Melchizedek, the priest of peace. Now, Melchizedek, we don't know much. He is not introduced by anything in the story of Torah. But he wasn't a priest like the Levite priest of the Moses, because Moses was 7 centuries later. He might have been a polytheist priest who became monotheistic, but he blessed Abraham. And Abraham blessed him too. And in that way, the first commission that God gave, that he will be a blessing to other people, started to take its own place. Melchizedek was an obscure biblical figure without any introduction to us. A new covenant was emerged at Shechem, and there it's called the Covenant of Pieces because there was a ritual. They built a place where Abraham put all the pieces of the animals that he collected and cut them into halves, and there was a terrifying darkness that came over Abraham to sleep. This is something happened before with Adam, before the creation of Eve. So this darkness, terrifying darkness, is a sign of a new era in the life of Abraham. Immediately after this covenant, funny enough, Sarah has other plans. She told Abraham, why don't you lie down with our slave Hagar and conceive an heir so that you can have somebody that could inherit all these things that you have? Notice this was not in consultation with God. He did, she conceived, and eventually things went very bad between Hagar and Sarai at the time because of jealousy. Another covenant happened. It's the covenant of circumcision, where God himself promised not just the land, but also a new child to be born from the relationship he has with Sarah. And the sign of circumcision started to take shape. Immediately after, 3 visitors came to the tent at where Abraham is, and they predicted to him and Sarah, of course, that they will have a child within a year. It was met with laughter. I have to be sympathetic to Sarah. Just imagine somebody being moved from palliative care to maternity ward. I think that was the level of the laughter that Sarah had. How could that be? She was already very old, and her husband was not any younger by any means. But even with that, there was a context of war. This time, divine punishment came back against the city of Sodom next door, and Abraham knew about it, and that's when he started negotiating with God about the righteous people who might be caught in the divine punishment. And he was thinking about his nephew for that. But here we find that Lot lost his house in Sodom, and he and his daughters fled into the countryside. And with the destruction of Sodom, the story narrative of Lot disappeared. So Abraham is by himself now. He continued to migrate to other regions in Shur and Kadesh, in the area of Gerar, where he met another king, Abimelech, and again he hid the relationship he had with Sarah as his spouse. Once Abimelech knew about it, he asked Abraham to leave. So when we look at foreign powers, Abraham was not shining star between Pharaoh and Abimelech. Something about foreign powers that didn't make him feel comfortable. He used trickery instead. At age 100, Isaac was born, as promised by God. And that was the end of Hagar and Ishmael to stay in the household of Abraham. They have to be expelled to the desert area with minimum provision. Now look at this treatment compared to what Abraham had when he left Egypt and Abimelech. Hagar did not have, by any means or any measure, something equivalent in terms of provision. This is very crucial for the case study of belonging. Funny enough, God approved this expulsion, but he did not forget about the well-being of Ishmael and Hagar. Then Abraham, business as usual, started to make treaties with Abimelech and made a fountain dug there in Beersheba. And Abraham stayed there a long time in the Philistine area. So Abraham was tested immediately after he lost Ishmael to the desert. He has now to offer Isaac as a burnt offering in the land of Moriah, the land that God will show him. It's somehow a very similar language to the first commission to go away from his father's kinship's land. When Ishmael went to the desert, Abraham was restless about it. When he was asked to sacrifice Isaac, he was very militant in following it. It's one of those narrative tension that I found very interesting. The testing has to be passed, but it passed without human sacrifice upon God's intervention at the moment he raised the sword against the child. When Sarah died in Hebron at the age 127, Abraham wanted to buy a plot of land to bury her. And he did, and he insisted to pay for the money for it, even though the land was promised to him by God. He had a different sense of possessions all of a sudden. And he said to the owner of the land back then, "I remain a foreigner and a stranger among you." Where's the sense of belonging for Abraham? Immediately after, he sent one of his senior servants back to his town in Haran to bring a wife for his son Isaac. And that's another image of unbelonging. He doesn't want his son to marry any of the Canaanite daughters. Eventually, he married Rebekah, who was Nahor's daughter. After a second marriage, Abraham died at the age 175 years. The Islamic side of the narrative is slightly different because in Islam, the Tales of the Prophets, which is a genre I studied in my doctoral studies, we find Abraham have a particular mission to destroy any polytheism that he was encountering. He was also considered as a prophet in Islam and a person who was projecting the advent of Prophet Muhammad in excellence of virtues and so on. But if we want to come back now to the story of Genesis, I would like to say this. Compared to the first 11 chapters of Genesis, the story of Abraham is a prolonged relationship in considerable detail. Adam and Eve had very short conversations with God. Even Noah had. It's the same thing with Cain. But with Abraham, there were long, lifetime-long conversations. Abraham in Genesis didn't fight for monotheism, but he grew into it. This is a sharp contrast to the Islamic counterpart of the same narrative. It was sufficient for Abraham to have a relationship with God who was telling him and showing him where to go. He had a dark side, which was revealed when he was encountering foreign powers like the Pharaohs and the Abimelech. His rescue of Lot comes as a correction to a previous first 11 chapters in the book of Genesis. Am I my brother's keeper? In a way, Abraham answered this question the way he took care of Lot. He was an altar builder, not a city builder. 3 times he built altars. He never built an altar where he lied about his wife. He always built them in areas away, in Shechem, in Bethel, and in the hill of Moreh, where he was about to sacrifice his second son, Isaac. In terms of wealth, Abraham was wealthy, but he knew wealth itself would not bring him a child. He knew the limits of wealth. He also rejected wealth from the king of Sodom when he rescued the town and brought back all the prisoners of war to the king of Sodom. Excuse me. God's promises, that's the real power in the narrative. They are hardly possible when we think, I'm going to give you all this land. land that have foreign people in it already. But also the promise of having a child from your own tissue as well as your wife's way after the age of fertility. And also upon the death of Sarah, how Abraham felt completely unrelated to the land and to the people there and the cultures. I remain a stranger and a foreigner in this land. Some migrants would do that too today. The good thing about Abraham, he never invented anything for himself to belong to. He was a free migrant. He roamed around the two major covenants of his lives. His responses were building altars, trusting where to go, and to move into it. In essence, if we want to see how Abraham belonged anywhere, he actually belonged to what God promised him. Human beings would like to take charge, and we see that in the example of Sarah and Abraham about having a child through Hagar. But overall, Abraham grew out of this. We are meant to belong to much larger states of what God delivers and promises. We build cities and nations, advance or developing. God builds a human family within his fidelity of promises that we can fathom in our context. And that's where the invitation to Abraham is. The sense of migration expanded the meaning of Abraham's life within the divine promises that we also sense from our God. I want to come back to Hagar here. Hagar is a very essential narrative figure, even though she didn't play a major role in the life or in the whole overall narrative. She was the mother of the first child of Abraham, and that's Ishmael. But Hagar was abused, let's be honest. She was abused by the person who was supposed to protect her, and that was her mistress. But at the same time, Hagar didn't have much of a chance to resist, except later when she was started to be mistreated. She fled twice, but her name is important. Her name has a meaning. Hagar means the one who is abandoned or the one who flees away. In a Semitic language, Hagar is related to the word hijra, and hijra means immigration. So we see Hagar, by name, she's a migrant. And also, the way she was mistreated, but the way she approached God, and the way she reflected about this God. When God answered her prayers, Hagar proved to be the first female theologian in the Torah. She called God El Roi. El in Hebrew means God. Roi is the one who sees me. God who sees me. This is theological reflection. She had a sense of who God is, the one who sees me, the one who is engaged in her life. Of course, when we look at the story of Abraham at the time of sacrificing Isaac, and when the intervention happened that Isaac was not sacrificed but a ram, and Abraham said that God will provide, etc. But Abraham also made a theological name. He called him Adonai Yireh, which means in Hebrew, the God who is seen. So let's put these two together. The God who sees me by Hagar, and the God who is seen by Abraham. These are two reflections coming from experience within the narrative of Abraham, saying something about their experience of God. The God who sees, the God who intervenes in history, but also the God who is seen, the God who is experienced by humans. And so we see here the whole migration issue is to bring us more closely to the understanding of who God is in the life of migrants, in the life of Abraham, in the life of Hagar herself. Both of them, Hagar and Abraham, came out with these two statements under extreme vulnerability. Hagar was to the point of extension from thirst and no food, no provisions given to her. And Abraham, who was to sacrifice his Isaac, upon whom the entire promise of God depended. So what would that mean to us? What can we learn about the whole story of Abraham vis-a-vis our stories in migrancy? Abraham belonged to his story, to his narrative, and we do too. We belong to our narratives. Abraham's story tells us something. We have to learn from his story how to transcend from our cultural norms and from our cultural limits to the possibilities of God through God's promises. Abraham's life was he opened the possibility of God within his limited context as a nomadic person. Dr. John Lennox, in his book, The Friend of God, which is another title for Abraham, asked two questions in that book, which I would like to share with you. When we look at the story of Abraham, two questions comes out. Whom do we serve? Do we serve God and use wealth? Or do we serve wealth and use God? These are two questions that are in big contrast to each other. And that's where the invitation of Abraham's story to our stories in migration. If we rightly belong to our narratives, then we have a duty to re-examine our life stories in light of Abraham's experience with the divine, under divine promises, and the complex relationships he had on earth with very difficult people like Sarah, Lot, Ishmael, Isaac, and eventually with Rebekah, the wife of his son Isaac. His diplomatic relations with King of Sodom, Pharaoh, and Abimelech were not easy at all. And his religious relation with Melchizedek, pleasant as it was in terms of the blessings that they exchange. And the land of several sanctuaries that Abraham had, that sense of the sacred in his journey of migration from one place to the other. All these difficulties, all these challenges that Abraham had could be ours too, and may shed to the challenges that we have in our lives. Hagar and Ishmael didn't receive any promise of a land, but they pleaded for a promise of a life and survival. And that God responded rather generously. Now, regardless of where we say we belong, to a culture, to a particular nationalism, to a land specific, to a certain career, then what does migration say about our true sense of belonging? In the case of Abraham, his sense of belonging was to his narrative and to the promises of God given to him. In migration, when we serve wealth and use God, isn't it true that we invent for ourselves what we belong to? For example, when we keep saying who we are nationally speaking. On the other hand, we have examples of that, like Lot and Bera, the king of Sodom. But when we serve God and use wealth, do we not enter the possibilities of God within our human limitations? And that's the story of Abraham pointing to each one of us. At first, Abraham and Sarah reacted with laughter to the letter. This laughter migrated into unquestionable faith for them. To be a daughter or son of Abraham, we are challenged beyond our reasons to face uncalculated possibilities offered to us by the same God who sees me, or God who is seen. Hagar's insight complements Abraham's. Both faced a broken world, and that were embedded in their narratives. Migration connects us to brokenness. It connects us to something that was lost, that is not there anymore. And yet it connects us to belonging through God's possibilities in our lives, if and only if we pay attention to them. We belong to our stories. We belong to the broken world. We belong to the promises given to us, which means hope is given to us. We also belong to the personal reactions to these promises, which means that the one who sees us is already heard too. Consider the invitation from the New Testament. Follow me. Remember these two words? Isn't that a statement of migration? Isn't it a migration journey to sharpen our sense of belonging? And therefore, our lives could resemble something about Abraham's life. He was commissioned to be a blessing to other people, and other people to bless him. So when we have migrants at our borders who are carrying their own promises and moved by these promises to share something with us, instead of fearing them, can we bless them as children of Abraham? Can we let them to bless us as also children of Abraham? Perhaps many migrants today are closer to the example of Hagar, who was once abused and left to fend for herself. But Hagar knew the power of the word and the power of her prayers to God, and came up with a statement that really reflects what the power of promises could do to each one of us. I'm not ending this talk. This talk will end. You will end it. I'm going to ask you to look at the person next to you and give them a blessing as children of Abraham. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Sami. We have about 10 minutes for questions. 10 minutes, does that sound good?
Well,
Yeah?
it depends on the questions.
Oh, it depends on the questions. We have 10 minutes to start, and Celeste has a microphone. So Father Sami will field his own questions, and if you have one, raise your hand so we can be sure you're mic'd.
I have a question, Father. Your roots are from Palestine, and I just want to make a sort of a general comment of how are you perceiving, experiencing the situation in Gaza, which is absolutely huge and terrible. How does that speak to you about Abraham and migrants, and can you say something about that?
Yes, I will try. I think the whole world is troubled by what's happening in Gaza, and I think that there's truth to this statement. Personally, I think it's the loss of so many lives didn't resolve anything. I mean, we talk about peace now, but what does this mean? Is there blessings between the peoples there? Are they acting as a source of blessing to one another? I think that's what Abraham would challenge the politics today. I would like to think of politics in that way. If you are a politician, can you pursue the common good that is as good and even very good to your opponents? That's the politics of belonging that we really need to have for our democracy to thrive in the future. That's what I think. And I think Gaza is a big lesson. We're doing it wrong. We need to be a source of blessings between neighbors. Please don't be afraid to ask questions. You're safe here.
I was really interested in your reflection on Hagar, and I'm thinking, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how Abraham, as patriarch, even though he's a migrant, has the power to bring all these people with him.
So what's the question again? Sorry, I didn't understand you.
Just your reflections on that idea that if Abraham, as patriarch, has this family, complex family, that he brings along with him on all these journeys, and what's your reflections on that situation? Thinking of Hagar, Sarah, etc.
Well, back then, I mean, nationalism was not there, you know. There were no borders, really. People just walked, went, moved from one place and encountered different cultures. So it was expected that lots of patriarchs were moving away, for some reason, away from Mesopotamia back then. It could have been they were leaving the polytheism, and maybe the imperial way of doing things was too much on citizens and people were losing their wealth like crazy. That could be the case too. So moving from one culture to the other was something part of the norm back then, rather than it's not considered as an invasion or occupation. Abraham did not occupy. He didn't abuse people in the lands that he entered. He didn't enter with an army. He wasn't armed. He was just a shepherd of cattle and some wealth. He did receive provisions, including slaves, so chances are Hagar was a slave given in Egypt when he left there. And for some reason, Sarah herself must have been impressed by her fidelity, to the point that she asked, among all other slaves, to be the mother of the first son of Abraham. So there is some credit here given to Hagar in that context. But Hagar was, I think, in my view, she represents those migrants who were pushed away, who are at the border, who were not allowed to get in. In fact, they were expelled. And there's a lot of cases today that we can relate to these migrants and refugees, displaced people, stateless people, to the story of Hagar. And Hagar had nothing left except her prayer to God. And God delivered, gave her something. And he promised that her son Ishmael will be also a great name and a father of different nations. So when we think about all of this, how God's promises, even to Abraham, doesn't mean that God's privileges are going to be excluded from other people. And that's the immense and infinite size of God's mercy for all nations. We're meant to coexist as a blessing to one another. And I think Abraham's story is very strong on that. And we need to look at it not just for our personal lives, but also for our institutions. Think of advanced education today in Canada. I think it is in a state of migration. We're moving away from a world that we used to know. We're entering into a world of AI, and we're entering in a world and language of budget balancing. The finances is the trump card in everything and major decisions. We need to go beyond that. That's what the story of Abraham is. He had so much wealth himself. But what did he listen to eventually? He moved from self-interest acts, such as with the Pharaoh and Abimelech, to sacrifice his only son just because God asked him. That movement is a migration of the heart too. And we need to do that and accept that. We need to shift from that self-interest and privilege-focused life to be a source of blessing and sharing our resources with the world at large. I think that's what spiritual life eventually means. I didn't mean to preach. I hope I answered you.
If there's no other question, I'll ask this one. So you began by talking early on about refugees, and you went on to talk quite a bit about migrants. And I'm wondering, how would you compare those two groups? Is a refugee just a special kind of migrant? But some migrants leave deliberately or voluntarily, and refugees do not. So what's your thinking around the differences and maybe similarities between refugees and migrants?
Well, first of all, both of them, what's common between them is they move from a comfort zone to a discomfort zone in most cases. And there's two. Refugees are forced to leave against their own will, as you said, and that's very true. But refugees also are, they're not makers of their own fate. They don't have much control or decisions that they can make for themselves. They are really helpless at times. Their strength is the promises they bring to the new territories. And they think that these promises is very important. Like I've heard refugees talking sometimes. They talk about returning back to their homeland, or they return back to the memories of the land. For example, in the case of my own parents, they spoke about their childhood in particular land in Nazareth and in the areas in Haifa and Nazareth and etc. and what happened during the war and when state of Israel, modern state of Israel, became a state, and how the Arabs back in the region were forced to migrate from one place to the other. Some with privileges, others were not. For example, my father's family had to move with their own furniture. My mom's family had to move with nothing. So when you think about that, I mean, the narratives changes that both are refugees. When you become refugees in the land that you lived in and you don't have the rights anymore. Refugees don't have rights. at all. I mean, what's the rights of the refugee except to breathe and to be under mercy of what provisions is giving to them? But to be frank with you, refugees are strong people too. We all struggle sometimes in the morning to go and wake up and face a new day. Think if you are a refugee inside a tent and you face a different reality that's really harsh and you have no control over. That's a different narrative altogether. So it depends on the narrative, I would say. Yes?
Here in Canada, our story is that Canada was formed by pushing the First Nations people off, and we put them into territories, Treaty 6 territory, Treaty 4, all that. So, and I'm quite connected with Indigenous people. So, like, they are, how would you describe the pain and the suffering of the journey of Canada, of refugees, immigrants, and how we have formed ourselves as a nation on top of and pushing out and creating all these rules for our First Nations people? Like, that is such a horrible mystery, isn't it? Or it's a mystery.
Well, I think you made a statement more than a question, but I could reply to you. At the moment, there is fear in the nation to agree on truth. DRC, for example, Truth and Reconciliation. People are not agreeing on the truth yet. What happened? The narratives are clashing. We need education. Education in terms of hermeneutics, how we approach our stories, and how we can see not just what happened to us, but what happens to others who are related to us or opponents. So our narrative needs an honest in-look so that we can understand better what happened actually. Because the truth has the power also to increase our compassion for the others. When I think of Abraham's story and what he migrated from and how he became open to God, even to have a child at age 100. I mean, biologically, it sounds impossible. It's a limited human context. But that gives me hope that what's happening in the Middle East, for example, is not absolutely hopeless. There's still God's possibilities for it. We rely only on politicians and the production of arms to deal with these conflicts. Same thing here in Canada. Where is Jesus in all of this? Where is Jesus in it? Where is his words that could help us to grow in compassion towards our Indigenous brothers and sisters? I define Canada as a land, an immigrant country on Indigenous land. I think there's truth to that. People came here, occupied it. They did things because they didn't know any better. People suffered, and people became hostile. Divisions happened. And peace never happens in divisions. Peace happens in unity. And love happens in communion. And therefore we need to bring these to the public sphere of doing things. We need secularism and educate secular world about these virtues, that it's possible to be peaceful with somebody who's different than ours, or might have a different ideas than ours. But we need to accept the role that we are a blessing to them and they to us. We need to do that. We have to, if we want to be authentic children of Abraham.
I think that was a little more than 10 minutes. Is that okay?
I told you it depends on
I
questions.
know, it worked out. I am so happy to thank you, Father Sami,
Thank you.
for
Thank
your
you,
lecture.
Dr.
I have
Thomas.
a little gift.
Oh, really?
In,
Thank you.
well, there's some honey in there.
Honey.
Heard you like honey? Yeah.
Yeah, I do like honey. Who
Yeah.
told you this?
It's just going around.
Yeah, somebody asked me to say grace, and I said, "Where is she?" Now I get honey.
There you go. There you go.
That's wonderful.
It's my privilege to do a few thanks, if that's all right. So I would like to begin by thanking Father Sami for your lecture tonight and for inviting us to think about our stories in conversation with Abraham and Sarah and the way that we are called to be a blessing, and I think to receive the blessing of others that we might see as other, and to consider that blessing that comes to the gates and comes to the borders. So thank you so much for that. And I have a few more thanks. I should introduce myself. My name is Cynthia Wallace, and I'm honored to serve here at STM as Associate Professor of English and also Director of the Irene and Doug Schmeiser Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice. That center oversees our programming in Catholic Studies, Peace Studies, and critical perspectives on social justice and the common good. And in those academic areas, we offer standalone undergraduate classes and also certificates and minors. The center also is an incubator right now for a network community of scholars and community workers working in the areas of the center, especially in faith and maybe humane values-inspired scholarship and community involvement. So if you're interested in any of those things, I would love to talk to you about them. But I am not actually here to infomercial that work. I want to give more thanks. It takes a village to pull off a public lecture, and so I'd like to express again our appreciation for the Leslie and Irene Dubé Chair for Catholic Studies and the generosity of that donation that makes this kind of work possible at our college. I'd like to express gratitude to Sarah Powery as chair of the Catholic Studies Advisory Committee and that committee for their work in organizing, and to the many divisions of our college that made this happen, so marketing and communications, IT, hello Earl, everybody can wave at Earl, and there you go, and maintenance, and also we have treats prepared for us by USAS Catering in the atrium. So as we end here, I would invite you to go all the way to the end of the hall and turn right and stay for coffee and some treats. The coffee is all decaf because we care about your circadian rhythms, but the sugar is real sugar, so do what you must with that. And finally, I would like to bring gratitude for all of you. It's no small thing to choose to spend an evening and to spend your time and attention on a public lecture. And so thank you very much on behalf of the college for your presence with us here tonight. And I ask you to join me one more time in thanking Father Sami.
Thank you. There's something she forgot to say about herself. She gives honey.
It wasn't me.